In the shadowy world of Tudor England, power was never secure, and ambition was often as dangerous as it was alluring. Among the figures who walked this perilous stage, few are as fascinating or as misunderstood as Frances Brandon, the mother of Lady Jane Grey. History has remembered Jane as the tragic 9 Days Queen, a young girl who was crowned and then condemned before she had scarcely stepped into adulthood. Yet behind her stood a mother whose influence, choices, and survival tell a story every bit as compelling as the brief reign of her daughter. Frances was not merely a spectator in Jane's rise and fall. She was born into royalty herself, carrying the blood of Henry VII through her mother, Mary Tudor. From her earliest years, she understood the weight of lineage and the opportunities it could bring. She grew up in a court where alliances were made with ruthless precision, where loyalty shifted with the winds, and where every noble family measured its worth against its proximity to the crown. Frances carried those lessons with her, and when she had children of her own, particularly her eldest daughter Jane, she was determined to see them rise. But ambition in Tudor England was a double-edged sword. Frances's dream of seeing Jane on the throne collided with the brutal realities of politics. In the summer of 1553, her daughter was proclaimed queen, only to be stripped of the crown within days. Frances lived through the triumph, the collapse, and the execution that followed. And yet, unlike so many others, she survived. Her story is one of power, loss, adaptation, and resilience, revealing that she was far more than the shadowy figure in Jane's tragedy. Welcome to our channel Words of Time. In this video, we'll uncover the life of Frances Brandon, her ambitions, her survival, and the legacy she left behind in the dangerous world of the Tudors. Lady Jane Grey, often remembered in English history as the 9 Days Queen, was born into a family whose blood tied her closely to the crown of England. To understand her life, her fate, and how she came to be a central figure in a moment of crisis, one must first look carefully at her birth and lineage. Jane was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII through his younger daughter, Mary Tudor, who had been married to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. This connection meant Jane was the grandniece of Henry VIII. That single fact of bloodline shaped the whole course of her life. She was not simply a girl born into privilege. She was a child whose very existence held political weight because in the tangled lines of succession, her claim, though secondary, was strong enough to matter in a kingdom often unsettled by questions of inheritance. Jane's lineage placed her just a few steps away from the throne, and in Tudor England, that position was both an honor and a burden. The monarchs of the time were acutely aware that the line of succession was never just a matter of family, but also a matter of national stability, international diplomacy, and factional ambition. Henry VIII had spent his reign obsessed with producing a male heir, and though he had 3 legitimate children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, questions about who might succeed them were a constant source of speculation. Jane, as his niece, was always in the background of these considerations. Her position could not be ignored, and though as a child she may not have understood the full weight of it, those around her certainly did. From her earliest years, her future was shaped not just by her family's affection, but also by political calculation. Her upbringing reflected this unique position. Jane was born in the autumn of the year 1537 at Bradgate Park in Leicestershire, the eldest daughter of Henry Grey, Marquess of Dorset, and Frances Brandon, who herself was the daughter of Mary Tudor. Jane's birth came only months after the death of Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour, who had given the king his long-desired son, Edward. The timing was important, for with Edward's birth, the succession seemed more secure, but it remained fragile. No one could predict whether Edward would live to adulthood. This uncertainty lent significance to every royal relative, and Jane was one of the closest. Thus, from the moment she was born, Jane was not just another child in a noble household. She was a potential figure in the ongoing drama of succession. Her early life was steeped in the culture of learning and piety that characterized the Tudor court at its best. Both her parents and her tutors believed strongly in education, and Jane was given a level of scholarly training unusual for a girl of her time. While most noble women were instructed in household management, etiquette, and perhaps some basic literacy, Jane was taught Latin and Greek, and she acquired a deep knowledge of scripture. Later accounts suggest she could also read Hebrew and was familiar with a range of classical texts. Her humanist education was not an accident of indulgence. It was a deliberate cultivation of intellect designed to fit her for a role greater than that of a quiet noblewoman. Her teachers, including John Aylmer, emphasized both rigorous thought and Protestant theology. The Protestant Reformation had already taken firm root in England, and Jane grew up firmly in its spirit. Her worldview was shaped by this faith, and she developed a reputation as a devout and serious young woman, devoted to scripture and moral reflection. Education did not only form her intellect, it also forged her character. Jane was remembered by contemporaries as grave beyond her years, more concerned with study and devotion than with the amusements that occupied many young nobles. Accounts suggest she often preferred the company of her books to that of her peers, a trait that set her apart and later contributed to the image of her as a pious martyr. Her seriousness was not merely personal preference, but a reflection of how she was raised. In her household, where lineage and potential destiny were never far from mind, education was a means of preparing her for whatever political role might arise. The moral and religious foundations instilled in her would later guide her choices in moments of crisis. As Jane grew, her parents' ambitions became more apparent. Henry Grey, though of noble birth, was ambitious to increase his family's power. Francis Brandon, being of royal blood, carried the weight of dynastic expectation. Together, they sought to position their daughter where she might bring advantage not only to herself, but to her family as a whole. In the world of Tudor politics, marriage was one of the chief ways this could be accomplished. Noble marriages were rarely about love or personal preference. They were about alliances, property, and influence. For Jane, this meant that as she reached adolescence, the question of whom she would marry became a matter of significant political importance. Her marriage to Henry Grey, Marquis of Dorset, was not her own, of course. Rather, it was arranged as a calculated alliance. In 1530, Henry Grey had inherited his father's title and lands, but by the time Jane was ready to be married, the Greys' fortunes were mixed. The match that was made for her was with Guilford Dudley, the son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who by then was the most powerful man in England during the reign of young King Edward VI. Guilford Dudley's father effectively controlled the government as Lord President of the Council, and through this marriage, the Dudleys hoped to secure their influence by binding themselves to the royal blood of Jane Grey. The union was highly strategic. For the Greys, it promised an alliance with the dominant political family of the realm. For the Dudleys, it offered a connection to the Tudor line that could prove invaluable should Edward die without issue. The marriage itself took place in May 1553, when Jane was about 16 years old. Alongside her wedding, there were other grand matches arranged, including marriages of her sisters. The wedding celebrations were lavish, reflecting the importance of these unions not merely as family events, but as national political maneuvers. Though Jane herself may have had little say in the matter, the marriage bound her fate irrevocably to the ambitions of her family and her in-laws. It was not a romantic choice, but in Tudor England, romance was not the point. What mattered was the strengthening of power, the tightening of bonds between influential houses, and the potential leverage such alliances gave in the shifting landscape of succession. The strategic aspect of Jane's marriage cannot be overstated. At the time of the wedding, King Edward was still alive but visibly unwell. His health was failing, and with no wife or children, the question of who would succeed him loomed large. Mary and Elizabeth, his half-sisters, were officially in the line of succession by their father's will, but both had been declared illegitimate at various points, and their positions remained contested. For Northumberland, Edward's chief minister, the prospect of Mary, a committed Catholic, becoming queen was alarming. His own power and the Protestant reforms he had advanced would be threatened. By marrying his son to Jane, Northumberland prepared the ground for a different solution, the possibility of Jane herself becoming queen. Her Protestant faith, her royal blood, and now her connection to his family made her an ideal candidate for his plans. At this point in her life, Jane was still a teenager, more scholar and student than politician. There is little evidence she desired power for herself, but the decisions of those around her carried her toward a role that would soon make her central to the kingdom's fate. Her marriage to Guilford Dudley was not the end of her childhood, but rather the doorway into a new and perilous chapter. It linked her future inseparably with the highest stakes of Tudor politics. For Jane, born to royalty, raised with a strong education, and married into ambition, her destiny was now set upon a course that she could not control, one that would ultimately place a crown upon her head and a target upon her life. Frances Brandon, Jane's mother, was a woman who carried her own sense of destiny. As the daughter of Mary Tudor, the youngest sister of Henry VIII, she had grown up conscious of her royal blood and the weight it carried. Though she never came close to the throne herself, she lived with the knowledge that her family's position placed her and her children within reach of power. In a world where lineage was a currency as valuable as land or wealth, Frances viewed her daughters not simply as children, but as instruments through which her family might rise higher. Jane, as the eldest, was at the center of those dynastic dreams. Frances had ambitions not merely for an advantageous marriage or a prominent household for her daughter, but for a claim that might stretch as far as the crown itself. These ambitions were not unreasonable in the context of the time. The Tudor dynasty, though formidable, was also fragile. Edward VI, though king in name, was still a boy when he came to the throne and never enjoyed good health. Francis, like many nobles at court, understood that his life might be short and that succession would once again be thrown into turmoil. In such uncertainty, proximity to the throne was everything, and Jane's position as the great-granddaughter of Henry VII made her a figure of genuine significance. Frances did not need to look far to see the possibility that Jane might become something more than a noblewoman. Her own royal blood, passed to her daughter, gave a sense of entitlement and opportunity that she was determined to press forward. Frances's ambitions for Jane found fertile ground in the political climate of the later years of Edward's reign. By the year 1553, the young king was visibly failing. His health deteriorated rapidly, and it became clear to those around him that he would not live to manhood. Edward was a devout Protestant, raised in a faith that was still fragile in England, where the memory of the old Catholic Church remained strong, and where many were ready to restore it should the chance arise. His half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was a committed Catholic, and according to Henry VIII's will and the Third Act of Succession, she stood next in line. To Protestant reformers and to those who had prospered under the changes of Edward's reign, the thought of Mary ascending the throne was alarming. They feared the reversal of reform, the loss of lands taken from the Church, and the possible reintroduction of papal authority. In this atmosphere of fear and expectation, Jane's position became ever more significant. She was not only of royal blood but also deeply Protestant, shaped by her education and personal devotion. Unlike Mary, whose religion aligned with Rome, Jane embodied the Protestant hope for continuity. For those like John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who held power in Edward's council, Jane was more than a noblewoman. She was a potential safeguard for the future of the Protestant state. For Frances, the thought of her daughter as heir to the kingdom was not an idle dream, but a possibility increasingly within reach. When Edward's health worsened in early 1553, the question of succession could no longer be postponed. Though the law in Henry's will favored Mary, and failing her, Elizabeth, Edward was persuaded to draft his own device for the succession. This document, shaped heavily by Northumberland's influence, bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth and named Jane as Edward's heir. Whether Edward made this choice out of his own conviction, his desire to preserve Protestantism, or the pressure of his council is still debated. But what is certain is that Jane was placed in the direct line of succession by the king himself. This moment was a triumph for Frances's ambition. Her daughter, once simply a noblewoman with good connections, was now marked as the future queen. Frances's dynastic dreams seemed to be on the brink of realization. It is likely that she encouraged Jane to accept the role, though Jane herself was hesitant. Jane's personal writings and the accounts of those who knew her suggest that she had little appetite for power and may even have resisted the idea. Yet resistance was not easily tolerated when so many powerful figures had pinned their hopes on her. Frances, driven by ambition and perhaps by the belief that God's providence was guiding her family's path, did not allow her daughter to shrink from the role prepared for her. When Edward died in July 1553, the succession crisis erupted. According to law and popular expectation, Mary should have been proclaimed queen. Yet the council, under Northumberland's direction and with Frances's full support, moved swiftly to push Jane forward. On the 10th of July, Jane was brought to the Tower of London and proclaimed queen. She was only 16 years old, and the crown that was placed upon her head was both a symbol of triumph and a burden that would soon crush her. In these days, Frances's role was not passive. She was not merely the mother of a queen. She was part of the network of ambition and calculation that had brought Jane to this point. Her dreams of seeing her daughter rule England were realized, but only briefly. The support for Jane's claim was shallow, dependent on the will of a few powerful nobles rather than the broader loyalty of the nation. The people, despite years of Protestant reform, still remembered Henry VIII's will and regarded Mary as the rightful heir. When Mary marched with determination to claim her throne, support gathered rapidly around her. Within 9 days, Jane's rule collapsed. The fall was swift and merciless. Mary entered London to popular acclaim, and Jane was imprisoned in the Tower, the very place where she had been declared queen. Frances's ambition, which had driven her daughter into the highest place in the realm, now became part of the reason for her downfall. Jane, who never sought the throne, paid the price for the dreams of her mother and the schemes of her father-in-law. Frances herself escaped the worst consequences, but the shadow of her ambition lingered, remembered by those who saw in her both a mother's pride and a dangerous hunger for power. Jane's role in the succession plots, though central, was also tragic in its passivity. She was the figure upon whom others built their hopes, but she was not the architect of those hopes. She was persuaded, perhaps compelled, into accepting the crown, and her brief reign was the result of forces beyond her control. Yet her acceptance, however reluctant, made her complicit in the challenge to Mary's legitimacy, and it sealed her fate. The story of Jane Grey cannot be told without acknowledging the powerful role of her mother's ambition. Frances believed her daughter could and should be queen, and in the charged atmosphere of Edward's dying days, that belief aligned with the interests of Northumberland and the Protestant Council. Together, they placed a crown upon Jane's head, a crown that proved far too heavy for a young woman of 16. What began as a mother's dream became a national crisis, and within days it turned into a tragedy that would end with Jane's death upon the scaffold. Frances's dynastic hopes, which had burned so brightly during the final days of Edward's life and the opening of Jane's reign, began to falter almost at once. The proclamation of Jane as queen on the 10th of July in the year 1553 had been accompanied by the formal ceremonies of power, yet beneath the pageantry there was little true foundation. The people of England, though exposed to years of Protestant reform, remained deeply tied to the will of Henry VIII and to the memory of his line. To them, Mary was the rightful heir, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and the sister of Edward. This loyalty was not easily shifted by the arguments of legality that Northumberland and the Council had advanced in favor of Jane. Frances was present at court during these days, her position as the Queen's mother giving her both privilege and responsibility. Her immediate reaction to Jane's proclamation was one of determination. This was the fulfillment of her long-held dream, and she was prepared to support Jane in every possible way. Frances moved quickly to establish her influence at the new court, maneuvering to protect her daughter's fragile claim and to secure allies who might bolster Jane's position. Yet she must have sensed, even in those first hours, that the foundation was precarious. Reports of support flooding to Mary reached London within days, and the mood of the people outside the Tower walls was hardly celebratory. During Jane's 9 days as queen, Frances found herself in a difficult role. She had no official authority, yet she carried the title of the Queen's mother, which was enough to give her both status and scrutiny. Some sources suggest that she attempted to press her daughter to act with more decisiveness, encouraging Jane to accept her role fully and to behave as a monarch should. Others hint that Frances herself was cautious, aware that the winds were shifting quickly and unwilling to tie her fate entirely to the outcome of Northumberland's gamble. In these short days, she walked a narrow path, torn between pride in her daughter's elevation and fear of what would come if Mary succeeded in claiming her rights. The collapse came with astonishing speed. By the 19th of July, Mary had gathered overwhelming support, and Jane's counselors deserted her one by one. Frances could do little as the proclamation of Mary as queen swept through the capital. For Jane, the transition from sovereign to prisoner was immediate and devastating. She was taken from the throne room to a chamber in the Tower, no longer a monarch but a captive. For Frances, the moment must have been almost unbearable. The crown she had dreamed of for her daughter was stripped away, and in its place came the grim reality of disgrace and danger. The arrest and trials that followed placed Frances in a precarious position. Jane, her husband Guilford Dudley, and the Duke of Northumberland were all charged with treason. The trials were swift and the verdicts inevitable. Frances herself was not placed on trial, but her role in promoting her daughter's claim was widely known. That she escaped punishment was due partly to Mary's willingness to show mercy and partly to Frances's own efforts at maneuvering. She was quick to distance herself from Northumberland, emphasizing her loyalty to the new queen and portraying herself less as a conspirator than as a mother swept along by events. It is possible that her kinship with Mary, both women being granddaughters of Henry VII, softened the Queen's attitude. Frances knew when to bend, and her ability to adapt saved her from sharing the fate of her daughter. For Jane, however, there was no escape. Though initially spared, she remained in the Tower, her youth and her unwillingness to seek the crown used as arguments for clemency. Frances must have hoped desperately that her daughter would be released, that Mary's mercy would extend far enough to allow Jane to live quietly, far from politics. For several months, that hope seemed possible. Jane's execution was not carried out immediately, and her captivity, though harsh, was not final. Yet the political unrest that followed, particularly the Wyatt Rebellion in early 1554, sealed her fate. The uprising, aimed at preventing Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, invoked Jane's name, whether or not she had any part in it. To Mary, Jane had become too dangerous a symbol to leave alive. The emotional toll upon Frances during these months cannot be overstated. She had watched her daughter elevated to the throne and then dragged down into captivity within the span of days. She had worked to preserve her own position, but the cost of survival was the slow realization that she could not save Jane. Accounts of the time speak of Jane's composure and courage in prison, her reliance on faith, and her acceptance of death as God's will. For a mother, this steadfastness might have been both a source of pride and a source of anguish. Frances had pressed Jane into a role she never sought, and now she had to watch as her daughter prepared for the scaffold. On the 12th of February, 1554, Jane was executed on Tower Green. Frances did not witness the beheading, but the knowledge of it would never leave her. Jane was 16 years old, her life cut short because of the ambitions of others. For Frances, the grief must have been overwhelming. The crown that had once seemed the pinnacle of her hopes had become the instrument of her daughter's destruction. Her survival, ensured by her careful maneuvering and her willingness to seek Mary's favor, was a hollow victory. She lived on, but she carried with her the knowledge that her ambition had helped lead Jane to her death. Frances's later years reveal the strain of this experience. Though she continued to play a role at court and eventually remarried, she never escaped the shadow of her daughter's fate. Her story is inseparable from Jane's, for it was her dynastic dream that had pushed Jane into the dangerous center of Tudor politics. In the 9 days of Jane's reign, Frances had seen her greatest ambition realized, but in the months that followed, she endured the consequences of that ambition in their harshest form. The survival she secured for herself came at the price of watching her daughter condemned, imprisoned, and executed, a cost that history has never allowed to fade. Frances Grey, who only months before had been the mother of a queen, found herself in the uneasy position of having to rebuild both her life and her family's standing in the wake of Jane's execution. The memory of those 9 days and the months of fear that followed lingered in every look and every whisper at court. Frances understood that her own survival had not been a given. She had been spared the punishment that others around her had suffered, but such mercy was fragile, and she knew that her safety depended upon her ability to show loyalty to Queen Mary and to distance herself from the events that had destroyed her daughter. This distancing was not simply a matter of words. Frances had to prove through her actions that she was no longer a threat. The Dudleys, who had tied themselves to Jane through her marriage, were almost entirely destroyed. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, was executed, and other members of his family languished in prison. Frances, however, moved with caution and care. She presented herself to Mary not as the ambitious mother who had thrust her daughter onto the throne, but as a grieving parent who had lost everything. It was a delicate balancing act. To insist too much upon innocence might have seemed insincere, yet to remain silent risked being associated with treason. She had to walk between these dangers, projecting humility and submission while quietly securing her future. Her kinship with Mary, as a fellow granddaughter of Henry VII, offered her some measure of protection. Though Mary had every reason to view Jane as a usurper, she may have recognized that Frances herself was not the mastermind of the plot. By demonstrating obedience and avoiding any suggestion of disloyalty, Frances slowly began to regain her footing. She remained cautious in public, careful never to allow her words or actions to be interpreted as seditious. This strategy of survival meant accepting, however bitterly, that she must detach herself from Jane's memory in order to live. It was a choice that history has judged harshly, but in the brutal politics of Tudor England, it was the only means of endurance. In time, Frances remarried, a decision that has been the subject of much debate among historians. Her second husband was Adrian Stokes, a member of her household and a man of far lower rank than her first husband, Henry Grey. Unlike her marriage to Grey, which had been shaped by dynastic ambition, her marriage to Stokes appeared to have been motivated by more personal considerations. Some contemporaries mocked the union as beneath her station, suggesting that Frances had diminished herself by choosing a man without noble birth. Others saw in it a deliberate act of self-preservation, for by aligning herself with a man outside the dangerous sphere of high politics, Frances made herself less threatening to the crown. It is possible that both readings hold truth. The marriage may have been, in part, an attempt to seek personal comfort after years of political turmoil and personal tragedy. Yet it also served a practical purpose. By remarrying a man of modest background, Frances signaled that she was no longer playing the dynastic game. No longer was she the mother scheming to place a daughter upon the throne. She was instead a woman who had accepted her diminished position. This act, whether born of affection or calculation, helped her secure her place in the shifting world of Mary's reign. Frances's life under Mary was one of restraint. She maintained her household, attended to her remaining children, and kept herself free of scandal or intrigue. In contrast to the years of ambition that had defined her earlier life, this period was marked by caution. She worked to repair her reputation, ensuring that her family would not be permanently stained by Jane's tragic fate. When Mary married Philip of Spain, a union that sparked unrest and rebellion, Frances avoided any involvement in the descent. She had learned through bitter experience that participation in plots, however well-intentioned, led only to ruin. The death of Mary in the year 1558 and the accession of Elizabeth I brought another change in fortune. Elizabeth was a Protestant and the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and her reign marked a return to many of the reforms that Jane herself had embodied. Frances, however, did not attempt to invoke Jane's memory as a way of regaining influence. She remained careful, recognizing that though Elizabeth might share Jane's religion, she was also fiercely protective of her own authority and would brook no rival claims. Instead, Frances presented herself as a loyal subject, willing to support Elizabeth's rule without reference to her daughter's lost crown. Elizabeth, pragmatic in her dealings with the nobility, appears to have accepted Frances's loyalty. The new queen had no need to punish the mother of a long-dead usurper, and she may even have seen Frances as a useful reminder of the dangers of disputed succession. Frances lived quietly in these years, her household sustained and her position at court secure though unremarkable. In a sense, her survival under both Mary and Elizabeth was her greatest achievement, for in a world where so many were destroyed by political entanglements, Frances managed to navigate the dangers with enough care to live out her days in relative peace. Yet the emotional cost of this survival was high. Frances had endured the execution of her daughter, the downfall of her first husband, and the destruction of the hopes that had once defined her. To rebuild her life required a suppression of grief and ambition alike. Her second marriage, her retreat from politics, and her careful cultivation of loyalty were all strategies for endurance, but they also reflected the loss of the grand dreams that had once driven her. She was no longer the mother preparing her child for greatness. Instead, she was a woman who had learned, through tragedy, that greatness could destroy as easily as it could exalt. When Frances died in the year 1559, only a year after Elizabeth had come to the throne, she left behind a complicated legacy. She was remembered as the ambitious mother whose dynastic dreams helped drive Jane to her death, but also as a woman who had shown resilience in the face of catastrophe. Her life after the crown was not glorious, but it was a testament to her ability to adapt and survive in the most perilous of times. She had once sought the highest honor for her daughter and had seen it turn to ashes. In her later years, she chose instead the quieter path of loyalty and survival, a choice that ensured her name would not join the long list of those destroyed by the ruthless struggles of Tudor power. Frances's story, especially in its final chapters, is inseparable from the larger tale of the Tudor dynasty. It illustrates the peril of ambition in an age when the throne was both the greatest prize and the greatest danger. It also reveals the strength of a mother who, even after the worst of losses, found a way to continue. The crown that had briefly adorned her daughter's head brought with it ruin and sorrow, but in its aftermath, Frances carved out a life that, while diminished, was her own. In doing so, she showed a different kind of courage, not the bold defiance of Jane on the scaffold, but the quieter endurance of one who lived on in the shadow of tragedy, carrying the memory of what had been lost. Francis's death in the year 1559 came not long after she had secured some stability under Elizabeth, yet her story did not end with her passing. In many ways, the judgment of her life began in earnest only after she was gone. For generations, she was remembered almost exclusively as the mother of Lady Jane Grey, the girl who had been queen for 9 days before losing both her crown and her life. That image of Frances as the ambitious, calculating mother who had driven her daughter to the scaffold proved enduring, but it is an incomplete portrait. To understand her legacy, one must look not only at her role in Jane's tragedy, but also at the broader picture of her life and the qualities that allowed her to survive in a period when few were able to do so. Frances has often been cast in the role of a villain in Jane's story, the stern mother whose dynastic ambition made her complicit in her daughter's downfall. This interpretation, however, simplifies the reality. Frances was a Tudor woman, and in Tudor England lineage was both opportunity and danger. Her royal blood tied her and her children to the highest stakes in the realm, whether she wished it or not. To have ignored the possibilities offered by Jane's position would have been unthinkable in the competitive world of 16th-century politics. The choices Frances made were shaped by this context, where family advancement was pursued with relentless determination, and where hesitation could mean loss of influence or worse. If Frances pushed her daughter toward the crown, it was not only because she desired glory, but also because the structures of her world made such ambition almost inevitable. To reduce Frances to the caricature of an ambitious mother is to overlook her resilience. After Jane's fall, Frances faced the kind of danger that destroyed most others associated with the succession crisis. The Dudleys were almost annihilated. Northumberland went to the block. Even minor figures who had signed documents in Jane's favor paid dearly for their involvement. Frances, however, survived, and not merely by chance. She understood that survival required adaptability. She shed the image of the proud, dynastic mother and instead presented herself as a loyal subject, a woman more concerned with her household than with politics. She managed to convince Mary of her submission and later secured Elizabeth's trust. That she navigated both reigns, each with very different religious and political expectations, is a testament to her political awareness and personal resilience. Her second marriage to Adrian Stokes also becomes more meaningful when viewed through the lens of survival. Contemporary commentators mocked her for marrying beneath her station, but the match was a signal to the crown that Frances was no longer playing the dangerous game of dynastic politics. By choosing a man of modest background, she placed herself outside the sphere of suspicion. It was a way of neutralizing herself, of ensuring that no one could claim she was plotting new ambitions through her daughters. At the same time, it may have offered her a measure of personal comfort after years of loss. The choice reveals her pragmatism. She was willing to endure criticism from her peers if it meant stability and peace. The endurance Frances demonstrated is remarkable when measured against the fate of so many others who had once stood close to the throne. The Tudor court was a place of constant peril, where even the most powerful could fall with terrifying speed. Ambitious men like Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Seymour, and John Dudley rose high and ended on the scaffold. Women such as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, queens themselves, lost their lives when political winds shifted. Frances, by contrast, endured both disgrace and grief, but found a way to continue. Her resilience allowed her to rebuild a life, modest though it was compared to her earlier ambitions, and to secure her family's survival into the next reign. Her legacy within the Tudor dynasty is shaped not only by her survival, but also by the impact of her earlier choices. By pressing Jane forward, Frances helped to ignite the succession crisis of 1553, a crisis that demonstrated the fragility of Tudor legitimacy. Mary's swift triumph over Jane reinforced the principle that legitimacy, rooted in Henry VIII's will and parliamentary statute, carried more weight in the eyes of the people than the schemes of nobles or even the dying words of a young king. In this way, Frances's ambition inadvertently strengthened Mary's claim and underscored the importance of clear succession. That lesson lingered throughout Elizabeth's reign, when the Queen, though reluctant to name an heir, remained acutely aware of the dangers of disputed claims. At the same time, Frances's story illustrates the cost of ambition in the Tudor world. Her dream of seeing Jane on the throne ended not in triumph but in blood. Yet the image of Jane as a Protestant martyr, remembered for her courage and piety in the face of execution, was in part the result of Frances's choices. By pushing her daughter into the succession, Frances set the stage for Jane's brief reign and tragic end, events that gave rise to a legacy far larger than Jane's short life might otherwise have afforded. In this sense, Frances's ambition ensured that her daughter would be remembered for centuries, though not in the way she had intended. The enduring impact of Frances's life lies in this duality. She was both the architect of her daughter's fate and the survivor who navigated its consequences. She embodies the tension between ambition and endurance that defined so many lives in Tudor England. Her story is not simply one of failure or of villainy. It is a story of adaptation, of learning when to press forward and when to retreat, of living in the shadow of the crown without being destroyed by it. In the years after her death, Frances's reputation was shaped largely by those who wrote about Jane. To many, she remained the harsh mother who forced her daughter into a marriage and a crown she did not desire. Yet modern reevaluations have sought to see her in fuller light. She was a woman of royal blood who lived in a time when her lineage dictated her choices. She was ambitious, yes, but she was also intelligent, pragmatic, and resilient. She endured personal loss that would have broken many others, and she found ways to continue even after the collapse of everything she had once pursued. The Tudor dynasty was marked by figures of dazzling ambition and catastrophic falls. Frances belonged to that world, and her legacy, though complicated, is a reminder of the perils and possibilities of her age. She was more than simply Jane's mother. She was a survivor who navigated the most dangerous court in Europe, who knew both the heights of dynastic ambition and the depths of personal tragedy, and who left behind a legacy that continues to provoke debate. Her choices shaped not only her daughter's fate, but also the story of Tudor succession itself. In surviving when so many did not, Frances left an imprint that endures, subtle but undeniable, in the history of the dynasty that defined her life.